SoundCartel.
Podcasting is undoubtedly global, so hearing from people in other countries about their take on the medium isn't only affirming, but also enlightening. This episode, Steve Pratt, co-founder of Pacific Content, joins us from Canada to talk podcasting and original branded audio.
I think time and attention are the most scarce resources on the planet now, and getting worse and worse and worse as something that's freely available. It's hard to get. So if you can get that and prove it over and over again, and you have an engaged audience of people who voluntarily sign up to opt in and say, I would like to hear more from you, I don't think there's a brand on the planet that would say no to that.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 3 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hello, Nick. Good to be back for another episode.
It is, and we've officially hit 2 million podcasts.
2 million. I can't believe it. It is astounding.
It is, but as we'll hear in today's ep, with the growth of the number of podcasts comes a growth in listenership and more opportunities for brands. And perhaps the 2 million and first podcast is worthy of mention, well, there or thereabouts. It's only one podcast, but it's the latest from Serial. It was such a pivotal moment for the industry when the first Serial podcast launched back in 2014.
It was, and we've referenced this before, Nick, but I have to say for me it was that breakthrough moment. When I heard that Serial podcast, I binged it over a whole weekend. I couldn't stop and I was hooked from then on.
And so many others.
Yeah, and that's why they call it the Serial effect.
Well, this new one is right up your alley as well, being US election fraud based.
Yes, another one to dive into if I can handle any more US election fraud. But it should be amazing. I'm really looking forward to it.
But today we're talking all things branded audio with Steve Pratt. We spoke to Steve on Podcasting Essentials 2 years ago, so it's great to have him back to hear what he's been up to and to share some of his podcasting insights and wisdom.
Yeah, he's a very wise man, Steve, co-founder of Pacific Content, an audio agency that produces podcasts and bespoke audio for brands, helping them tell their own unique stories. Brands like Ford, Atlassian, Shopify and Facebook. Steve is very much an early adopter. He's been podcasting since 2005.
Around the same time we started podcasting.
That's very true. And he's been involved with a number of media startups over the years. A well-respected and referenced name within podcasting, Steve has an eagle eye on the industry and knows as much as anyone about producing audio for big brands and how they can take advantage of it.
Welcome back, Steve, to Podcasting Essentials.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be back.
Now, it's been 2 years since we spoke on this podcast. What amazing branded content have you produced since we last spoke?
Our whole philosophy of doing this is that it's not worth doing if you don't do it well, and that if we're bringing in a lot of brands who've never done this before, that we're going to be their first experience in podcasting, we want to hit it out of the park every single time we do it and for them to have an amazing experience, not just for Pacific Content, but for podcasting overall. One that was a big one for us was Ford, because we hadn't done anything with an automotive company before, and they were relaunching the Ford Bronco after 20 years. And we had a bunch of different conversations with them, and they were wonderful people. And they said, like, what do we need to do to make a really good show? And we were really honest and just said, like, you got to lean in and tell the real story. Like, you have to talk about things like OJ. And they said, yes, that's awesome. Like, we want this to be real journalism, and we want it to be a real documentary about the history of this. And they were just amazing partners every step of the way. So we made this show called Bring Back Bronco, and it charts kind of where the Bronco came from and all the different bumps in its journey and path and why it disappeared. You know, OJ was part of it, but not the whole thing. And then there's this amazing movement at Ford for like 20 years called Bronco Underground of people who've been trying to bring it back. And they let us in on all of it and all the new stuff about how it was coming out and launched. And we got Sonari Glinton, who is a former NPR journalist in automotive and finance, hosting it, and layered kind of the parallel histories of Detroit and the US with the Bronco. Like, there's really interesting patterns in it. And we're so proud of it. And it did really, really well. It's our first serialized one that we've ever done. And after the first episode, where we have a little bit of sampling, all the completion rates are over 100%, which is nuts for us. Like just amazing testament to like the people who like it and signed up really enjoyed it a lot and listened more than once in a lot of cases.
How long are the episodes?
I think about 25 minutes, 25, 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
You know, it's interesting because a lot of our best practices don't have a really heavy brand touch. Don't make the show about your own products and services. And this was a really interesting strategy pivot for us to lean into it and say the whole show is about the Bronco because it's this piece of pop culture lore and it's just a really iconic car with a fantastic story that as long as we don't make it feel like a commercial, it is the right thing to do. And I'm kind of glad we took the risk and that Ford was so wonderful to do that as well.
And how did Ford go about finding their audience of Bronco fanatics?
So it's quite interesting. So there's a variety of different things, and some of them are Ford superpowers. So they've got all sorts of different ways to contact Ford customers. They've got dealerships and email newsletters and social media. They got on the front page of the Detroit Free Press, the newspaper there, on the day of the launch with the head of communications at the company doing an interview about who is a Bronco owner, talking about this thing.
Wow, that's really drawing on your superpowers.
But also, we worked with them and their agency, GTB, to do a very specific podcast media buy. And there are some very specific shows in the podcast universe that are a perfect fit. If you might be interested in the Ford Bronco, this is the right show to put it on. It's called Past Gas. They did just an unbelievable job of a custom host read, like really, really amazing. We found several shows like that just knocked it out of the park for exactly the right target audience to get people excited about the show. And we used Chartable's smart links to be able to measure the effectiveness of all of those and see the conversion rates from different shows into listening to the show. And it did really, really well across the board. So I think smart paid promotion for people who are already podcasters with the right target audience and the right subject matter and unlocking all the superpowers of a big brand like Ford, it did really well.
And I think that's also a really good example of what we're talking about, Nick. Our theme for this year, 2021, is brands to be brave. And Bronco could have said, no, we're not touching OJ. It's fraught with danger. But as you said, Steve, they leaned into it and it's paid dividends.
Yeah, it really is interesting. Like one of our probably at this point overused terms is creative bravery. We use it all the time.
Yeah.
It's a way to really kind of remind everybody in the room, our team, but also our clients, other partners that are involved. You're competing with 2 million other podcasts out there. You've got to make an awesome show. You've got to be creatively brave. You've got to push outside your comfort zone and think about the listeners first and foremost. And I think we're at the point now, like we've been doing this almost 7 years, which is crazy to me. We have enough case studies, good and bad, to be able to share data that the creative bravery really works. And it works for completion rates. It works for getting larger download numbers. Like when you market it and people show up and there's a great show, they stick around. And it works for all the brand lift pieces as well that people really appreciate and remember, you know, a company that makes a real show that's a fantastic listen.
Yeah.
Taking a step back for a moment, Steve, you said that there are now 2 million podcasts, which is incredible, but audiences are also increasing. So why should 2021 be the year that brands consider podcasting if they haven't already?
I just feel like the measurement is at a point and the listenership is growing to a point where there's enough people out there who are listening and there's enough ways to prove that it works. Almost the larger the number of podcasts, the bigger the unfair advantages are of brands to be able to differentiate themselves in the space. I know this is kind of obvious, but, you know, brands bring a decent budget to be able to make a show. They can do a narrative story. They can do documentary work. We can do sound design and music. We can make a real top shelf show with a brand. Those are the ones that will reach generally a broader audience, that will drive higher completion rates, that'll make you feel something, which is what you want to associate your brand with feelings. You can do all of that sort of stuff in podcasting at a fraction of the cost of a TV commercial or other things. The budget is affordable and you get huge, huge amounts of time that you can't get on any other medium. So if I look at the Ford one, getting over 100% completion rates on a half-hour show, I know over 100% sounds impossible, but the way that they track it is if you listen more than once, it goes over. But it's like you just can't get that amount of time and engagement anywhere. And I think as the rest of the digital universe kind of goes more to short form, I've become cripplingly addicted to TikTok in the last year. And I love it, but it's 15 seconds or a minute. Same thing with Twitter and Instagram, and like a half hour with your brand over and over and over again it's an amazing, amazing opportunity. And the measurement is better.
I often refer to a blog that you wrote, I think probably a couple of years ago now, about completion rates and some research you did between long-form audio versus long-form and even short-form video. Do you want to just reveal those results in your words rather than me always plagiarizing?
I think if you look at anybody who does YouTube videos regularly, or especially as a brand, it's pretty hard to get completion rates above 40 or 50%. And most of the time on the videos is pretty short, like sub 5 minutes for a lot of it. It's not a perfect analog, audio to video, but I think people are used to looking at completion rates and how much time you get per video. Audio just blows it out of the water. And there's obviously reasons for that. I think that a lot of different contexts for when people listen and how they listen. But it is also just that piece that audio is driving theater of the mind for you when you do it well, and your level of engagement is really, really high, that if you're telling a story and you plant a big juicy hook in the first minute of the episode, people want to stick around and hear how it ends. And a lot of podcasts, people are learning things, especially if they're coming from brands. There's a lot of opportunities to share really interesting stories or to help people understand really complicated ideas or new exciting areas. Time makes a difference on those to be able to do that well. And I think people come away feeling smarter from a lot of podcasts as well.
So, Steve, we've talked about success that you can have on the consumption side, but what about ROI? Because at SoundCartel, and I assume it's the same with you guys, brands are always asking us what ROI they should expect for their podcast. And I'd love to know how you answer this question and how you set KPIs with your clients.
Yeah, it's a great question. But the answer is it depends, because it depends on why a client wants to make a podcast. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to what is the ROI for every podcast from a brand. For the majority of the ones that we work with, it is a branding exercise. It's a top-of-funnel brand positioning, brand awareness tool, I guess. And the idea is if you get a lot of people listening to your show over and over again, and it's about a certain theme that you want to be associated with as the brand, they will start associating you with that by spending lots of time with you. And if they eventually make a purchase decision, if they've been spending a lot of time with you and you've been making them happy or smarter or telling them amazing stories, they have a relationship with you and they're going to choose you compared to other people. So on that side, I think there's an editorial measurement that we've been talking about, the completion rate, where the amount of time spent of being able to actually show clients, everyone who clicks play, this is how much time they spend on average with your podcast, out of the park. I think time and attention are the most scarce resources on the planet now, and getting worse and worse and worse as something that's freely available. It's hard to get. So if you can get that and prove it over and over again, and you have an engaged audience of people who voluntarily sign up to opt in and say, I would like to hear more from you, I don't think there's a brand on the planet that would say no to that. The other piece is we work with, it's a company called Signal Hill Insights based in Canada. We do a ton of work with them on brand lift studies, and they're just terrific at it. They've got kind of a control and an exposure group, so you can ask questions on what people think about a brand without having ever listened to the podcast. And then it's a single exposure to one episode for another group. And our benchmark for it is a 66% increase in brand favorability after having listened to one episode. Wow. That does not track multiple episodes, a whole season, multiple seasons, any of that sort of stuff. And it's super impressive, but it also in some weird way is not surprising. If somebody makes a show that you like, and you might be expecting an infomercial or you might be expecting a hard sell, and you get a wonderful show, you're going to like them more. Like, I don't think anybody's going to be disappointed that Ford made a fabulous show about the Bronco. So, but I will say, the other interesting piece as a success metric or an ROI is we are seeing different reasons for coming in to make podcasts. So some of them are mid-funnel shows where it is very specifically for people who might have listened to the broad access show that now goes into talking a little bit more about an industry for people who are interested in that. And will those people go to a website from a brand? So like some of those things are measurable. And again, it's all opt-in for anybody who's interested. But if you're interested, having another audio solution that can get people potentially to the point where they might eventually become a customer is, I think, appealing. And the other one are things like internal podcasts, where it may be HR or culture or internal communications for a company. And some of those ROI pieces may be like, what percentage of employees are listening to this? And what's the feedback from employees? And has it changed the employment brand internally? Are you changing behaviors with the topics that you're putting out in the podcast for your company as well?
For those internal or private podcasts, have you done any sort of equivalent testing like you have with the brand lift to put any data around whether people's opinions of the business have improved?
I don't think we've done anything formally with an employee base, but an interesting one. So about 2 years ago, Pacific Content was acquired by Rogers Sports and Media. It's Canada's largest wireless carrier. They do home internet. They own the Toronto Blue Jays. They have 56 radio stations and a sports network. And we made a podcast for their employees, but it was also a public podcast. It wasn't in a private feed. And so we made a podcast called For the Love of Work. And it's about different issues about where work is going, but more for employees and your own career. And something like 26,000 employees in Canada for Rogers. And they have an internal communications network of a tool called Yammer. And they've got just a ton of use on there. And they used all their internal communication tools to put this podcast out. And the feedback that they got on the internal channels was insane. Like, I've never seen anything like it. Just like tons of people being like, here's what I got out of this episode. I love this. This is what I love about working for Rogers. Thanks for making this show.
Wow.
I learned so much from this episode. And again, it's kind of the mentality that they created it as a gift to their employees, and also to show the rest of the world what kind of an employer Rogers is, that, it's a chance to showcase your values. So it was all kind of spontaneous, open in the public pieces around the impact it made. And I know that everybody at the company is really proud to have put something out that's had that kind of an impact on people.
Mm-hmm.
So, Steve, for brands that are maybe new to podcasting and coming into the market, what's your message if their focus is purely a monetary ROI?
Honestly, a lot of the time we will say, like, I'm not sure this is the right medium or the right strategy for you to do it, because I don't think anybody signs up to be sold a product. If you want to drive sales in a short period of time, you have to talk about the product. You have to push people to do it. And I think that at that point, you really are making an infomercial, and you might have a select group of buyers who want to know about your company. Maybe it's product education for the right group, for people to learn more about it or to learn about new releases of software. Or I could see it in certain cases, but for the majority of the ones that when we have that question, I think put yourself in the shoes of a listener and think about what a hard sell sounds like, and whether you would voluntarily spend 30 minutes with that on an ongoing basis, or whether you would listen once and never come back.
Yeah, really good point. So then what styles and formats do you think work best for brands? We hear a lot about interview and narrative, but are there other options that brands should consider?
I think audio is still a wide open space where there's just a lot of stuff that hasn't been done yet. I almost hesitate to say this is the right format. I think the criteria is you should be differentiated, is that you should do something that is different than what is already out there. And, I think we use the phrase a lot, what's the show that only you can make? And whether that's your point of view, whether it's your values, whether the experience of where you do business or what you do, there is a gift you can provide to listeners, and that will lead you down the format of figuring out what the right type of show to make is. I think brands have the ability to make a differentiated show quality-wise as well. And I can't think of, maybe this is not true anymore, but there's not a lot of brands making commercials shot on their phones. There are some for stunts, I guess, but there are iPhone commercials that look beautiful shot on iPhones. But I guess the point is that this reflects your brand. It's not just the stories that you're telling. It's also the quality of the audio. It's like, are you editing it? Are you using good microphones? Are you using all the things that you want your brand to be associated with and baking that into the strategy for the show? I don't think most brands want to be thought of as we did it cheaply and quickly and a bit sloppy. Storytelling, again, like any sort of narrative piece or anything that will grab your attention and want you to listen through to the end, and anything where you can make people feel things, I think is really powerful. We generally will veer away from chat formats because they're the most popular format out there and it's hard to differentiate. But it is also harder to have a one-take interview that just is really compelling all the way through and has emotion in it and gets people to want to stick around to the end. Except for this one.
Except for this one. The only one. It's going to go top of the charts.
Are you able to reveal any of the secret sauce that goes into producing the most engaging and effective branded audio content?
Well, I wish it was more secret than this. It's awesome storytellers. It's really good people and putting time and effort into doing fewer things better. I think we live in an age of a lot of disposable content. And I think there's a lot of podcasts out there where the right business model, if you are making an original show, is generating a lot of inventory. It's not an accident that The Daily is The Daily and does really well because it's daily. It's a great show, but it also...
You mean The Daily from the New York Times?
Yes, yeah.
Oh my gosh, my favorite podcast. I love it. I listen to it every day. It is phenomenal. The production is astounding. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there. I'm a big fan.
No, and there's a lot of people that work on it, right? Like they have knocked it out of the park, but they also have the resources to be able to do that many episodes a week. When you think about it from a brand standpoint, the level of conversations you need to have around what the topics are, the number of different people who need to listen to it or approve it, sometimes it has to go through legal or compliance, the ability to set up a marketing plan to be able to promote the show. It really is about the patience and the time and resources to do it right so that you can be differentiated and make that creatively brave show, and that you can market it really well and make sure all the right people know about it.
Yeah, sometimes less is more. Do less really well and, like you say, differentiated rather than trying to bite off more than you can chew.
We would honestly say to people, like if they're coming in saying like, oh, we'd like to make 20 episodes, but we have a shoestring budget. It's like, well, why don't you make 6 awesome ones?
That's right.
And have a marketing budget for those 6. And over again, it has a much bigger impact, something that lives onwards.
Excellent segue, Steve, because I want to talk about marketing and growing the listenership for a branded podcast. Now, we've already talked about that brands have a bit of an advantage because they already have an audience. But what tactics have you seen your clients use to best effect to grow an audience? And how do brands reach out beyond their existing audience?
So we do an audit with every new client, and it's from day one. Dan Meisner is our head of audience development, and he's just so smart about this and has really shaped a lot of our thinking on doing this. And we learned the lesson the hard way of having some of our early shows not do as well as they could have. And I think originally we were like, yeah, you know what? We can't control everything. We don't have those channels. Like no one's going to give us the keys to a brand's social media or email newsletters. And so we backed it all the way up to the very first interactions we have with a new client. And we've got so many case studies and so many pieces of data around the effectiveness of using brands' channels and existing kind of owned and operated channels to market shows. It's not, but it's almost a condition of working with us. Like we talk about it so much early on and start talking about it before we've even made the show. And everyone's different. And so, kind of going through and doing an audit and getting a list on a wall or in a Google Doc or something of all the different ways that a particular brand can reach people. And some of them are websites, some are social channels, some are, they own web browsers, some they own auto dealerships, some they own bank branches with digital signage in it. Everybody's got them and they may not always recognize it. And as a podcast nerds coming in, just being like, oh, we could promote the show here. It's going to be really exciting. I think different lights turn on in different conversations about it. And when they find out that we can measure a lot of that now with tools like Chartable, it's even better, because I think there's still a perception for some marketers that a lot of podcasting isn't measurable or that they can't figure out what's working or isn't working. And when we kind of show them, yeah, you can actually go from social media to audio. You can go from paid audio ads to audio, from audio to websites, and see attribution rates on that. For a marketer, that's a really exciting thing. And the other one, and this is a really big thing for Pacific Content in the last couple of years since we spoke, is that Dan has built a team doing media buying only for podcasting. And he's built this tool called a neighborhood graph where you can go in and zoom into any category or subcategory in a podcast and see the different clusters of shows where listeners are in common between those shows. Like if you listen to this show, here are all the other shows that those same people listen to. And you see these little communities or neighborhoods of podcasts in there. And so we can go to a client and say, like, what neighborhood do you want your podcast to live in? Where do you want to build your house? And how is your podcast in this neighborhood going to be different than everything else that's in there so that you're special in that neighborhood? And then when you're marketing it, we're going to go buy ads on all those other shows that are already the people that you're listening to. It's very similar to what we were talking about with the Bronco episode. Find the right shows with the right target audience, really work with those hosts on custom host reads, get them to listen to the episodes of the show so that they can actually talk about it with authenticity and put measurement on it. And that's the way that you get audiences that are outside of your existing reach.
How do you measure the host-read ads or the effectiveness of the host-read ads?
You can put chartable links on, if you get it on both sides, if you get it on the podcast that you're buying the ad on and they integrate chartable into it on the smart ads, and then you have it on your own podcast, there is attribution between those.
Now, Steve, taking a slightly different tack, I want to talk about the Infinite Dial for 2021 that's just come out from Edison Research and Triton Digital. It's showing a huge increase in smart speaker ownership. How can brands capitalise on the boom in households buying these speakers?
I think it's experimentation. I feel like COVID is a big behavior changer on so many different levels in media, and it's been really interesting. I think there's a lot of speculation that podcast listening would go down with the absence of commutes and things like that. It just changed behavior. So there was a spike in the morning commute and there was a spike in the afternoon commute. And it's just leveled off throughout the day. And the consumption is back going up again above where it was before. And that some of the places people are listening are different, so that they're listening in web browsers more than they used to. And smart speakers are obviously a big beneficiary of that because everybody's stuck at home. And I think the piece that has not fully been explored is, how do you take advantage of the unique properties of a smart speaker? How do you take advantage of the room of the house that people are listening in? How do you take advantage of the fact that it's not headphones in and it's just more of a social thing where there may be families or roommates around? How do you take advantage of the fact that it might be a little bit more background compared to a foreground podcast? And I think that there are content strategies just sitting on a plate for brands to come in and maybe own a room of the house, maybe own a time of day, own something that's more of a social listening piece. Maybe it's a different length of show. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity that will come in the future for creating things to be part of routines. You know, there's routines on all these smart speakers for like keywords, whether it's good morning or good night or whatever it is. If you can build yourself into the future of people's morning routines when they wake up with something that's really interesting, like maybe a short nugget in the morning, I think you kind of win. And thinking about what smart speaker queries you want to be the answer to, I don't think that everybody's figured out exactly how smart speaker SEO is going to work, but I have a strong hunch that the best answers will still win in the future. And it's probably not just going to be a robot reading Wikipedia forever. So experimentation, again, think about, let's not talk about ourselves. Let's create value and be the really good answers to questions we want to be associated with. Those all feel like interesting strategies. I'm kind of waiting though. Like I've been waiting for brands to jump into smart speakers and smart speaker adoption to jump for several years. And I wonder if COVID is the thing that will start triggering more experimentation in that space because of this jump in listening.
And while the quality of the speakers improves and more speakers are going to be installed in people's homes, that surround sound sort of installation, imagine what you can do with immersive audio. You don't need to have headphones on. You could have a group of people in a room and the sound experience could raise the hairs on your arms. So I think there's lots of fun stuff that could be done. And we haven't discussed Clubhouse on this podcast yet, but I know that you have some quite strong opinions and have been trying a few things yourself. Do you want to just talk briefly about the implications for podcasters and perhaps more importantly, what brands might need to know or how they can get involved?
There's a lot of like a frenzied social media conversation about, is Clubhouse going to kill podcasting? And, is social audio going to replace podcasting? My strong opinion is no. I think there'll be competition for people's time and attention, just as there is with everything else on the planet. Any form of media is competing with time and attention. But I think they're serving different purposes, where Clubhouse is not well suited to narrative. It is not well suited to big emotions and quality edited storytelling. It is not well suited to evergreen things, of creating value over time where you make a really awesome asset and it just increases in value over and over and over again. And podcasts are not well suited to being really timely and topical and reactive, and they are not well suited to being interactive. And I think there's a real crackling energy to live and the ability to actually have conversations and feel a connection with listeners of Q&A stuff. It matters a lot. Like I think it's a really new use case, a lot like live radio, but live radio with no borders and no frequency pieces. So I think about the same thing in a way as like, what's the best half hour or hour of programming that you could do on podcasting versus the same question on Clubhouse? And they'd be two really different shows that really play to the strengths of the medium. Even on demand, like I can curate and go set a list of things that I would like to listen to in podcasting. I love that experience. Clubhouse is trying to drive appointment listening where like I actually have to go tune in at a certain time on a certain day. It's hard globally, right? With different time zones. I miss a lot of stuff that I would really like to listen to. But, almost like that Oprah, Meghan, Harry interview where all sorts of people appointment watch TV for the first time in a long time. Elon Musk showing up on Clubhouse can drive a ton of people going in and doing that. And there is something magic about being there in the room when it's happening. So I think for brands who want to get into that space, there's a lot of people trying to figure it out in real time. There's a lot of people who have not hosted live events before who are hosting live events, and we'll learn some new stuff in there. And there's some best practices that I think will probably get passed on from people in groups that have done a lot of that. But ultimately, make an amazing hour that is going to get people really excited to come in and do something live and take advantages of all the strength of the medium. I can't imagine that brands aren't going to be excited about finding ways to do that.
Steve, I just want to talk a little bit more about listenership because whether it be Infinite Dial or any range of surveys, we see that podcast awareness and listenership, they continue to increase independent of each other. But there is still a gap between the two, quite a significant gap. So, for example, in the US, awareness is at 78% and listening is at 57%. Of course, this is a massive opportunity for producers and advertisers. But what do you think is going to close that gap and get more people actually listening? Is it just time, or do you think it'll take another big milestone like the podcast Serial provided in 2014?
It's a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer to it. I have a couple ideas, but I don't know. My gut is that there's a legacy to podcasting where a lot of it came out of the public radio space around the world. And my first podcast was at the Canadian public broadcaster, CBC, in 2005. Public media around the world were some of the first people to jump into podcasting and have been promoting it for a long time. So if you're not a public media person and that doesn't resonate with you, you may have a bias against podcasting in there. Tom Webster is one of the guys who also puts out the Infinite Dial, has talked about language a lot, that for a long time podcasting has said subscribe, and that a lot of people think that you have to pay money for podcasts when they're free. And that's a barrier. And I almost feel like when we've talked about kind of creative bravery and the different formats that are out there, there are not shows for everybody yet. When we look at other media formats of movies or TV or things like that, they're not all represented in podcasting at a quality level that's going to bring in large audiences. I think there's going to be more experimentation in format that will close that gap. I'm a bit obsessed with the idea of short form audio when I think about younger audiences who don't want to commit a half hour, an hour to listening to a show. Is there a social version of short form audio of 15-second or 1 minute things that are going to start coming out? And I look at the tools that Spotify with Anchor are starting to build in terms of trying to grow more creators. I think my favorite podcast interview about where the future of podcasting is going was on the A16Z podcast last August maybe, and it was like the Spotify head of R&D, a guy named Gustav, who was being interviewed. And it was really about the shift to creators and thinking about how to empower more creators, that podcasting in some ways is still too hard to make. Even though there's 2 million of them, it's hard to make a podcast. It is hard to get it in all the distribution centers. The more that companies like Spotify think about how do I make this as easy as TikTok has made making video, the more people will put stuff out and different types of creativity will blossom and younger, different listeners will come in. So I'm quite excited to see what that has in store for podcasting and all the different creative things that'll come out when you put in some different kind of weird constraints of making it easy to create and consume. I don't think there's been a model where on-demand has not worked. There's 2 million things I can choose from and it's all free. It's a pretty great value proposition. And I'm not sure what else to do other than let people know that that's actually what's out there. They're like some of the smartest, most interesting, best storytellers, all for free. You've got like all sorts of different options, and it's often better than what's on now.
So right.
Yeah, yeah.
So final question, Steve, and you've already touched on a few things you'd like to see, but it's been a huge 2 years since we spoke. But what's the future hold for this little old industry we call podcasting? What would you like to see, and where should brands be looking to get involved?
Pacific Content started as we make branded podcasts, really blunt, like this is what we do. And then we changed it to we make original podcasts with brands of just pushing this idea that they're shows. They're not branded content. They're shows that happen to be made from brands. And now we've been talking today about things like Clubhouse or short form audio, smart speakers. I feel like it's almost digital audio is the playground for brands, and figuring out what an overall digital audio strategy is where things are going. And where a brand strategy determines which platforms they should be on and which formats they should use. I don't know if there's going to be a one size fits all, but I know that people are going to want to be on more than just podcasts going forward. But the principles of a great branded podcast apply to all of those other pieces as well, of being listener first, probably in most cases, light brand touch, and differentiating yourself by being focused on quality and all the values of your brand that you would put on any other platform. Is that an okay peak?
Couldn't have summed it up better. We completely agree.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials. Hopefully it won't be another 2 years before we get some more wisdom from you.
Thanks for having me. I love talking to both of you about all this stuff. It's nice to talk with other, I hope it's okay to say this, other nerds about this space. It's awesome. Yes.
We consider ourselves nerds. Thank you so much, Steve. You've really been fantastic, made some outstanding points. Thank you so much again.
Thanks for having me.
Geez, he just gets it, doesn't he? So much great advice for brands and for creators from Steve.
Yeah, and a lot of what he says we talk about internally here at SoundCartel and with our clients, and of course on Podcasting Essentials as well. I definitely recommend subscribing to Pacific Content's blog. It's a great way to regularly access the thoughts of Steve, Dan Meisner and the other smart folk at Pacific Content. And we'll put a link to their blog in our show notes. Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me for another great episode.
It was brilliant. Thank you, Nick.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at soundcartelAU.
And of course, during continued crazy times, if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now.
From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.